All right, well, let's get started. I trust the rest of our group is ready to go. I want to thank you all for being here today. My name is Merlin Chatwin, and I recently took on the role of the Executive Director at Open North. Granted, I may be biased, but I think you all made a really good decision to be here and join the session today. I have the distinct pleasure of working with or closely adjacent to each of our speakers and our moderator. And I'm consistently struck by their commitment, their empathy, and brilliance in no particular order. And I trust that you'll recognize that throughout the duration of this session. So, as we begin, I would like to acknowledge that from where I am speaking, I'm on the land and traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the neutral peoples, also referred to as the Attawandaron, on what is now known as Cambridge, Ontario. And I acknowledge the Indigenous people who, prior to and after the arrival of colonists, encountered one another on this territory. We know that settler colonialism and its impacts are still present today. We're unfortunately reminded of this over the summer when some long ignored Indigenous knowledge entered the public consciousness through finding the remains of hundreds of people, mostly children, at government-imposed residential school sites across the country. And despite this, Indigenous cultures and governing systems have remained resilient and continue to flourish today. At Open North, we recognize that data has been an instrument of colonialism in Canada, and we seek to engage with and learn from approaches like Indigenous data governance and the OCAP principles to inform our perspectives and our work. As land acknowledgements are necessary but an insufficient step towards a reconciliation, we encourage you to read about being an ally and consider the risks as well as the opportunities that data and technology pose for Indigenous communities. We'd like to point you towards the work of institutions such as FNIGC, the First Nations Information Governance Center, who, among other groundbreaking work, produced the First Nations data governance strategy that seeks to uphold Indigenous data sovereignty. And at Open North, we're partnering with Indigenous-led organizations like the Firelight Group to thoughtfully integrate Indigenous approaches to data and technology. Next slide. About Open North, we aim to ensure that data and technology are applied in ways that benefit communities and the overall public good. We do this through research, capacity building, solution design and implementation, and cultivating networks for collaboration. Our partners and clients include all levels of government, academia, and nonprofit organizations across Canada and globally who seek to take advantage of the benefits of technology in a way that is problem-driven and values-led. Next slide. For today's session, we're framing our conversation with the definition of open smart communities developed in 2018. And I'll just read it. An open smart community or an open smart city is where residents, civil society, academics, and the private sector collaborate with public officials to mobilize data and technologies when warranted in an ethical, accountable, and transparent way to govern the city as a fair, viable, and livable commons and balance economic development, social progress, and environmental responsibility. And this work started when a team at Open North defined a vision of a city where technology is appropriately situated within a given context and its use reflects our values. This work influenced how smart city funding across Canada could be targeted, including how residents and the public were included in envisioning and deploying smart city technologies. As with any good idea, the concept of open smart cities is a work in progress and becomes a catalyst for new and interesting work. And our moderator today, Matthew Pladel, continues this research and thinking in an upcoming paper exploring the interaction of civic value and civic values, which he'll talk more about. Next slide, please. So for today, we're inviting you to join us in critically thinking about how we can do values-based work and what it means to use data and technology for the public good. In order to do this, we are considering two areas where questions arise about creating civic value: the use of artificial intelligence and the maintenance of cybersecurity at the local level, of which our two speakers will explore. And today, we're particularly interested in the role of participation in the process of creating civic value, asking questions like what public participation currently exists with building and maintaining these technologies, and how should it be more or less integrated. Next slide. Finally, our conversation is situated in the context of local government. We begin with a set of general beliefs about the state of local government. For a number of systemic issues, they operate within capacity and resource constraints and are slow to adapt or to adopt new technologies and sources or uses of data. However, they are increasingly forced to address complex social challenges by virtue of their proximity to residents and the failures of higher levels of government. To address these challenges, local governments are increasingly required to facilitate local networks and develop intersectoral and multi-level collaborations. So with that setting in mind, I'm so glad today to welcome a close collaborator of Open North to present his work on civic values. Next slide. Matthew Claudel is a designer and writer. He holds a doctorate in advanced urbanism from MIT, where his work focused on the emerging practices of urban experimentation as they relate to civic value. He's the founder of Field States, a benefit corporation whose mission is to generate civic value using strategic design. He's an affiliate faculty in Portland State University's Department of Geography. He was previously the strategic design lead for Curative, a healthcare company seeking to end the COVID-19 pandemic. At Curative, he piloted and implemented a number of projects, including the vaccination program, which grew from a concept and strategy to 1 million doses delivered in 5 months. Matthew served on the jury for the Canadian federal government's $50 million Smart Cities Challenge and supports the continuation of the program as a strategic advisor for the Community Solutions Network through Open North. And just a note, I had to cut off a number of paragraphs of Matthew's intro so that we could fit it within the time. Needless to say, I am privileged to work with and happy to turn it over to you, Matthew.
Merlin, that was incredibly generous. I'm really excited to be here with you all. I'm excited about this session. I think it's going to be really generative. There's a lot that's not known about data and technologies, and specifically AI and cybersecurity as they relate to local government. These are new territory, and I think they present a lot of risk, and in many ways we should proceed with caution. They also present a lot of opportunity. And so my request as a moderator is that during this session, if you come with preconceptions about either the risks or the opportunities, to suspend your disbelief and to dwell in a space where we can explore both the risks and the opportunities. And when you have critiques, make them really specific. When you have opportunities or use cases, make them really specific, and that'll help us have a really generative conversation where we can excavate the potential and explore how we can mitigate the harms that come with these sorts of technologies. And in fact, that's really the approach we took when we were defining civic value. So Merlin mentioned we did a white paper recently through Open North, where we were exploring what civic value might mean, and specifically in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. This radically upended a lot of the norms and the processes around how local governments work all the way up to the federal level. And so we wanted to explore the ways in which that presented opportunities for doing things perhaps better, and also the risks attendant to those changes. So, yep, thanks for advancing that slide. What is civic value and what are civic values? So I want to first start by making a distinction between those two things. Civic values means defining what we collectively care about and where we draw moral boundaries around technology. This is sort of the terms and conditions of technology, and those need to be constantly and locally rediscovered and deliberated in order to have a kind of common understanding and a shared sense of what values we hold locally. Civic value is the quantitative and qualitative benefit that arises from a particular policy or process or technology. And crucially, it's both now and it's in the future. So as we talk about civic value, we need to understand the ways in which we're making trade-offs with potential, for example, financial value that we can capture now, and what that means, what the long-term implications are for what kinds of value we'll be able to play with in the future. And this includes the mechanisms and the capacities to govern any particular policy or technology. And so by introducing that definition, we were able to look at things like what it means to outsource technology development to the private sector, for example. So next slide. What we were really interested in was how you define civic value. And I believe that in order to discover that and to define it, you need to be both critical and creative. That means continually asking if and how technology really benefits residents, and assessing to what extent all residents are able to capture that value and enjoy it. It's also something that that is really practical. You know, this is not abstract. It sounds very abstract, but there are tools that exist within local government that can be used for creating civic value. These are things like a municipal budget. These are things like measurement dynamics, things like service delivery and communication. So as I said before, this has been particularly important over the course of the pandemic. Everything has changed. Everything has changed interpersonally. Everything has changed in local governments. And there have been positive and negative outcomes from the perspective of civic value. So if you go to the next slide, Megan, AI and cybersecurity are really good examples of this. So on one hand, imagine you have improvements in free public Wi-Fi systems. Saskatoon has been a leader in this, and they've really revolutionized the way that they deliver public Wi-Fi during the pandemic. On the other hand, you have sensitive health data, and that's been collected and monitored in all sorts of new ways. You have things like vaccine passports becoming a norm. And those things, in the interest of pandemic response, haven't been adequately scrutinized in a democratic process. And so there have been positives, there have been negatives. And in that context, it's been interesting to explore how we can take a values-led approach to using data and technologies. So I'm really excited to get into this with our speakers, who I'll introduce in a moment. And before we get into that, I just want to drop some leading questions that perhaps can condition the conversation. And these arise from conversations that I've been lucky enough to have with Renee and Aisha in the past few days. So leading questions. For me, this is about how we collectively define civic values and build long-term civic value with AI and cybersecurity protocols. I'm interested in understanding how residents are involved in this process at a local level and what their roles and capacities to govern these systems are. And finally, I'm interested in understanding how these technical systems can be designed to create long-term value and mitigate long-term harms. So these leading questions, who bears the risks, especially in a public-private partnership? Does more data always lead to better decision-making? There have been some interesting studies recently that suggest perhaps not. When do governments prefer not to know? An example of this is information that can be accessed under Freedom of Information Act, and that ends up conditioning a lot of these projects. How do we mitigate chains of consent? This is an incredibly troubling phrase I've heard recently, and it sort of denotes situations where if I've consented to one thing, then all of a sudden I implicitly consent to other things. And what are the necessary preconditions to engagement with a resident population? So with that, I want to introduce Renee. Professor Renee Seiber's research focuses on civic engagement in computational technologies. These technologies range from geographic information systems, or GIS, to open data and smart city tech, including climate modeling and artificial intelligence, things like computer vision and natural language processing. Dr. Cyber is a fellow with the American Association of Geographers and was awarded the Canadian Association of Geographers Lifetime Achievement and GIS Science Excellence Award. She's increasingly focused on AI and geo-AI and is currently the PI of a project called AI for the Rest of Us. In addition to being on a number of AI ethics committees, Professor Cyber co-hosts the AI in Canadian Municipalities Community of Practice. So I'm eager to hear her thoughts and turn this over to you, Professor Cyber.
It's Sieber. I'll give you a pass. Can everyone see me? Okay, good. Hi, everybody. Great to be here. Love to hear the conversations so far and we're about to have. So what is participation? The key civic value when AI is introduced into the open smart city? Good question, Renee. Glad you asked that question. Next slide. I always think that it's useful to talk about what AI is because there is so much magical thinking about what it is and what it can accomplish. A lot of cities are using AI already. They are using machine learning. They are using logistic regression. They're using Bayesian statistics. They're using random forest and decision trees. So we're already doing that. It does show up in open data in terms of what's called feature engineering, where you're modifying the data itself to fit, for example, Socrata, because Socrata, in order to use its platform, maybe you requires to submit data in a certain way. So we may already be using a certain amount of that, of machine learning. But when people talk about AI, they're mostly talking about deep learning, like convolutional neural networks, and then they're talking about automated decision making. So why am I talking about AI as a part of Open Smart Cities? Is because AI has this magical quality within city governments, the same way that geographic information systems did a long time ago. That supposedly it contributes all of this efficiency, labor savings, insights. It's going to be really useful for business intelligence. I say that it's also supposed to be objective and fair, and perhaps Matthew will ask me or others will ask me about whether it's truly fair or not and contributes to civic values. I gave a couple of talks to the Canada Revenue Agency on AI ethics, and AI can be used for surveillance. It can also be used to punish people via predictive policing. So it may or may not support civic values. Why is it important for open data? Is because most AI, machine learning, ML, DL, deep learning algorithms require a lot of data. And a lot of that data has initially come from open government data, as well as from data Aisha will talk about that's contributed by individuals, for example, on Twitter or Instagram. And as I implied already, it can be antithetical to civic engagement, to participation, especially because it tends not to be open. So it tends to violate the norms of open data and open by default. The algorithms can be incredibly computationally opaque. The algorithms that a city may procure can be proprietary. Don't touch our algorithm. Cathy O'Neill has an algorithmic, as she wrote, Weapons of Math Destruction. She has an AI auditing company that actually compels companies to submit their algorithms for testing. That's not often done. And as I mentioned before, it can be an instrument of surveillance. So those smart lampposts are watching you. Okay, so next slide. So often civic value in this space is framed as responsible AI or sometimes AI ethics. This tends to focus on AI ethics as codes of conduct. In other words, it puts the responsibility on an individual employee to do good. So you open data and smart city practitioners, as long as you dust off your course notes from whenever you took a course that talked about, how to do GIS or statistics, and follow the best practices and make sure your data is up to date and complete, then you're good. You don't have to worry about any problems. Now, the FACT community, and FACT stands for Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency in AI and Machine Learning, says that we need to stop focusing on individual codes of conduct and focus on potential societal impacts. So we need to go away from focusing on our efforts to protect the privacy of individuals or to debias the data to the harm that the algorithms may cause. Of course, similar to open data, a big hole in all of this is that the tendency to focus on transparency and technical fixes as opposed to legal accountability. Now, many AI ethics assessments and audit tools focus on, to the extent that they do, stakeholder engagement or participatory design. And I asked the question, is that enough? And what about civic engagement in this space? Next slide, which you'll see a ton of stuff. This is a result of 2 or more years of research as part of that AI for the Rest of Us grant that is looking at what does meaningful participation look like in the context of AI, where AI citizens may be participating in AI procurement, and or they may be participating, AI may be used as a part of the participatory process. So I'm going to leave you with that because I've run out of time, but just to say, this was based on Sherry Arnstein's classic letter of civic participation. That was done in 1969. Almost all ladders and frameworks are built on this. I use this, and her point was that participation is linked to empowerment, and that there are many forms of participation, quote unquote, that we may use that actually are considered by many to be non-participation, or at most token participation. And what she was looking for, many of us are looking for, is ways for meaningful participation that may include legal accountability and also a bit of disrupting the status quo. The end.
Great ending. Thank you, Renee, and I apologize for mispronouncing your name earlier. I hope I don't do the same for Aisha, who is our next speaker. Aisha Zamudio is a senior analyst at Open North, where she works to improve communities' work using data and technology. She enjoys exploring technologies and tools from a social perspective. As a result, Aisha has recently evaluated the cybersecurity discourse practices from Mexico and Canada as part of her master's degree research. She has experience working with Mexican government and civic organizations in the justice and health sectors. So Aisha, I'll turn it over to you, and then we'll get into some questions. I've been taking many notes on questions for both of you, and I encourage the audience to post questions in the chat window as well. So Aisha, take it away.
Thank you so much, Matthew. I'm happy to join the conversation. Yeah, you can change the slide, please. Yeah, so I will be talking about cybersecurity and the links with the smart city and public participation. So first, the first thing that I want to say is that the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency from the United States has defined cybersecurity as the art of protecting networks, devices, and data from unauthorized access or criminal use, and the practice of ensuring confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information. For this talk, I will focus on the term of confidentiality. So we explored the issues related with confidentiality and cybersecurity. So cybersecurity, I want us to think that it's at the heart of the transition to a digital society. And it's important because smart cities are about interconnection. The interconnection between the different segments that a government manage. Let's say, for example, the public sector and public safety and waste management and water management. All of those areas are working in independent way. And when they become in a smart city, they actually are interconnected. But by making that interconnection, the interconnection in between them, this digital infrastructure can have some vulnerabilities. And that's where the cybersecurity becomes relevant for the smart city context. So when we create this data, and the governments are creating this data because of citizens and because they themselves are creating it, we are actually making the case for storing the data. And by storing the data, we are creating the need to protect it. And that information that is protected, it contains most of the time sensitive information that make the case for cyber criminals to try to steal and monetize the attacks. So the massive collection of this data is both beneficial for cybersecurity purposes because it will enhance the systems, and it will enhance how they are made, and they are purposed for the security terms, but also because because they are saving this intrusive this information and sensitive information. This could be intrusive for individuals. Next slide, please. So one thing that we need also to make sure is that smart cities need to invest in data security to protect the critical infrastructure. So this is to make sure that they have a minimum risk involved, and also to make sure that they have a stable, reliable, and secure smart system. Critical concerns that relate to the cities and the smart cities and local governments are the sensitive data exposure, which means making that sensitive data is properly protected, but also the broken access control, which means that the restriction for authenticated users are put in place, because if those users that are not properly authenticated about what they can do and cannot, could open the door for cyber criminals to come and try to control and exploit the vulnerabilities. And third, it's the security misconfiguration, which is the #1 issue on cybersecurity, because incomplete, ad hoc, or default configurations of operating systems, libraries, or applications can, if they are not patched or updated in a regular basis, they could actually also become a problem of the configuration and the security problem for the organization. And with this comes along also the risk of emerging technologies. When local governments and governments in general adopt a technology, they actually they should be planning for the future in order for not the technology to become obsolete and they become dependent of that specific technology. Because when the companies stop updating these the programs, they're actually creating a vulnerability for the systems, and the criminals tend to look always for vulnerabilities to attack and control the technology and the infrastructure. So an approach to solve these issues, involved the public and residents in this process. And the image that you see there, it refers to the Australia's cybersecurity strategy, which creates a process between governments, community, and business, so they can all participate in setting the agenda when it comes to security implications. And so they enhance the process and they make a stronger policy in terms of digital security. Also, another approach that the same Australia government is taking is to making sure that the cybersecurity it's implemented at the organizational level, so that public officers have the minimal information and the minimal understanding of what is cybersecurity and how can they implement it in their daily activities. Next slide, please. Yeah. So in terms of cybersecurity for this, in the context of civic value, we need to understand that every time that we click a platform, a web platform, we make use of a web page, or we download an application in our own telephones, we're actually leaving a digital trace. And most of the time we are unaware of it, and we have little control over where this is going and how is this data being used. So it is a paradox that that we find ourselves on, because in one side, the data that we generate creates better systems, enhances smart cities, and creates more secure places, safer and competitive cities. But at the same time, the same devices and the same technology could become potentially a surveillance tool that can affect the mechanism that can affect the liberties and become mechanism of oppression and repression for individuals. So to put it as an example, the city of Shenzhen in China, even if it's an extreme example of how the cybersecurity of the digital devices that secure a city, it could be taken as an example of this process, because in that city, basically the Chinese government, what it's doing is to use digital cameras and mobility systems and transit application to look for Chinese Muslim communities who are a minority in China, and to limit and restrict their private rights and their liberties. So even if it's an extreme case and an extreme example, we can see how the Shenzhen city has the potential for a digital tool to become a technology that can make the place for to become a surveillance tool. Because of this process of surveillance and these concerns, we also have to reflect on the fact that the privacy and data could be misused, yes, by public organizations and governments, but also by private companies. And this raises the questions about privacy and how these the private companies are abusing of the use of this data. So I just want us to think about when data is the practice of selling and repurposing the data. Yes, it is a private activity, but what is the role of the government of that and that process? And to what extent are governments willing to sanction the enterprise that are engaging in intrusive practices? And I will leave that my conversation for now.
Thank you, Aisha. That was terrific. Thank you both. So there's a idea that's come up in both of your conversations, and that's the idea of citizens' control. And I'm curious about this kind of paradox between opportunities for residents to be in control of their own data and the burden that places on people. So many of the frameworks actually that we discussed today place some kind of burden on the user, deciding when and how my data is used or monetized. This is sort of the Facebook and Google approach. There's the idea, and this picks up a little bit on the question that S. Cote was putting in the chat. This picks up on the idea of becoming a good citizen or a good user of data. I have to make decisions or opt out. And so I'm curious, especially in the case of auditing and holding a government accountable to its commitments for data security. That's an even greater responsibility. So I'm wondering the trade-off, yes, in terms of security and control, but also in control and the burden that's placed on users. Renee and Aisha, it's a question for both of you.
So I see we don't have a lot of time left. I don't believe in individual control, period, where it concerns the government. Civic values runs antithetical to individual control. I know this sounds really radical, but civic value is about collective responsibility, and it's about collective control. And I think the nice thing about being in Canada is we have models for collective control. They come out of OCAP, they come out of our First Nations communities. So cities need to think about that. I am very, very ambivalent about data trust, because I think data trusts can it's too easy to outsource the governance of data trust to the private sector instead of maintaining its control by local communities. And I think it's as a part of trying to get some measure of trust in municipal government and higher levels of government to look at collective control. I hope that makes sense.
Aisha.
Yeah, to me, it's really, I think also as individuals, I will go against the thought of Renee, but we as individuals, we should be more aware, and it's also about having skills and become more aware and more thoughtful about the decisions that we make, and also like kind of train ourselves in this digital environment. So yes, to me, it's also like it's a combination of these individual decisions, but also like us as individuals should be more aware of where are we leaving our data and what are we doing, and be more like thoughtful about how to demand to governments about this process, and private organizations too, about what they are doing and how they are using our data.
I think this is really interesting. And so what I'm hearing is, Aisha, that there's some amount of capacity building and knowledge development on an individual level, and Renee, that the mechanisms of control should be at a collective scale and not an individual one, which I think is a really interesting framework for understanding how we can appropriately structure digital systems to generate civic value in a long-term way. So we've only got a few more questions. I just want to make an open call to the audience before I dive in with another one. Feel free to put it in the chat. So I'm interested, again, a question for both of you, in these situations where governments prefer not to know. The risk that data is accessed through a Freedom of Information Act or some such. And this is both something that governments fear, and it causes them to hold back from engaging with data. It's also a condition that disincentivizes private sector companies from working with governments because they fear that the resulting data could be accessed by competitors. This is obviously a question of cybersecurity. So Aisha, I want to start with you here. And Renee, as you think about the structuring of large training data sets, for example, how do we appropriately manage that with the relationship between public and private sectors specifically? Aisha?
Yeah, I cannot reflect on a situation where private organizations will decide not to participate because governments could mishandle his data. Like, to me, it's more the other side, the reverse situation. Like, governments are more willing to see or to leave the place to construct these partnerships because they see a lot of advantages of out of this process. Like, take as an example Waze. In many countries, in many cities, it's being used. The transportation minister is using data from Waze, and they have this partnership, and it's useful for both because the government doesn't spend a lot of money, and Waze they can collect more data, right? But when they do that, they actually creating a problem for the citizen. So that's where actually, yeah, it's an individual process and a collective process, as Renee said. But this created the tension not between them as partnerships, but between us as a society and us as individuals with them, public and private organizations, as partnership.
Renee, any last thoughts?
Yeah, it's an important question. I would have two responses. One, compared to the US, Canadian government is incredibly risk averse. So it's hard to advocate for closing off data as opposed to open by default. Conversely, Canadian governments often will look at absolutely anything as a potential revenue source. So it's not merely a matter of closing off data, it's a matter of creating proprietary pipelines to the private sector. It's like only you can get our data and nobody else, and we will give you maybe local company competitive advantage. So it's a really fraught situation. I mean, I like open data, but open data can create enormous harm. But right? On one hand, you want data to be open and open by default. On the other hand, it can create harm. And on the other hand, it can be used as, oh, we can make money off of this. So I don't know exactly where to go. And this is a durable problem vis-a-vis open government data as well as AI.
Yeah, thank you. Well, hopefully this session has been a first step to revealing some of those challenges and working toward new ways of dealing with these complex questions. So thank you both for being here. I really have enjoyed the conversation. I hope to keep it going as we move forward. I hope that the audience is also interested in reaching out to us and continuing to engage in these sorts of questions. There will be more from Open North, and this white paper will be published very soon. So without further ado, thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Open North, for convening this, and I look forward to hearing from all of you soon.
Okay, bye.